Welcome to The Backstage Creative, the podcast that focuses on the people who work behind the scenes of theater. My name is Krista Copper. I'm a bass player who loves playing for theater. Multiple times a month, I sit down and talk to people who work behind the scenes of theater, who create and build and rehearse and practice and mix and design and organize and do all of the thousands of jobs that go into creating a live production. It's such an honor and a privilege, and I greatly appreciate everyone who sits down and talks with me. Today is my conversation with Eaton Saylor. Eaton works primarily in the Kansas City area, in the sound world as a sound engineer, amongst other things. Eaton and I have worked together. He and I worked together at Creed Repertory Theater. So, surprise, another person that I've worked with in Creed. I can't say enough good things about Eaton and the quality of work that he produces. This interview was especially fun because I got to do it in person. Most of these interviews, I don't get to do it in person. I live in Kansas, and so access to people can sometimes be challenging. But whenever I get to do an interview in person, it's a little less awkward. Being able to be in the same room as someone else makes the interview process a little smoother. Someone told me once, theater is just really a bunch of socially awkward people getting together and creating art. And I think that's so true. And so sometimes these interviews can be, there's an awkward level to them. And part of that is just not being in the same room as someone. But this worked out well, that Eaton and I could sit down and have a conversation, which I hope you'll enjoy as much as I did. So here we go. Here's my conversation with Eaton Saylor. So today I want to start this interview different than how I've started other interviews. And I want to start off with a story. So Eaton and I have worked together. One of the shows that we did was 9 to 5. And fairly early on in the run, we're playing 9 to 5 in this particular tune. Grooves really hard, and the high point of the tune are playing loudly, and the bass player gets to play a low E. So on most basses, the lowest note they can reach is an E. Some basses go lower, but the standard is a low E. So it's always, I enjoy playing it, right? Because you get to play, like low notes are fun. And when they're loud, it's even more fun. So we're playing and we're building, the band's rocking, we're going to this low E, and I hit the low E, how I've always done. And the most beautiful amplified bass sound came out of the monitor. And I was like, what? Like I hadn't done anything different. And I looked up with this huge smile on my face, and I looked around at the band, and every single one of them was looking at me, just like huge smiles on their faces, just like, that look of like, oh yeah. And this low E just was like filled the space, which isn't that hard because the pit was pretty small, but just the greatest low E I've ever heard come out of my bass when it was amplified. And I wanted to take all of the credit for it, but I could not, because the sound engineer is Eaton, and it was great. Which leads to my first question of, how do you adjust what you're doing based on the room that you're in?
That's kind of one of the fun things about being an audio engineer, is especially for musical theater, because we hit so many different rooms and for so many different reasons. And every room, every band, every show has its own unique challenges. The first thing to do is always just listen to the room and learn how it sounds, because you're not going to be able to change how the room sounds. So you've got to just adjust to the room and adjust to make sure that what you're doing is going to be beneficial in that room. Creed was one of those places that I've been for a few years, so I had a bit of an advantage to be able to already know the room and kind of do what I wanted to do with it. I mean, I even helped build the sound system for that room, so I had a lot of advantages when mixing in there. But yeah, it's just, you're not going to be able to change what the room is doing, so don't fight it, embrace it, and let it help you, whether it's because the room is super, super reverberant or dead, or if it's got a lot of extra bass in the room, or whatever it's got. You just gotta embrace it and use it to your advantage, because if the more time you spend fighting it, the more time you're going to be miserable while mixing.
Mm-hmm. Sure. how do you handle, like during a show when you have all of the the board with everything in front of you? How do you handle? How do you prioritize? I guess what needs to happen, right? Because you're in control of a lot, and things happen. And how do you prioritize what you're doing in any given moment?
Well, the first priority when you're mixing is always, does it sound good? Even that's not necessarily simple because it might sound good to you, but does it sound good to the person sitting next to the booth, to the person in the front row, person in the back of the house? Does it sound good to the band in the pit? Does it sound good to the performers? But for a live show, the first priority is, does it sound good to the audience? And it doesn't matter what you think as the mix engineer, it has to sound good to the audience. So that's always the first priority when making those mix decisions, at least for me, is how do I make this sound good for the audience and get them engaged with it? But a big part of making sure the audience is engaged and it sounds good to them is making sure that the artist's on stage, whether it's the band in the pit or if it's a band on stage or the singers on stage, making sure that they're happy and that it sounds good to them. Because if it doesn't sound good to them, it's a lot harder for them to get into it and really perform their best. And if they're not performing their best, your job's a lot harder trying to make them sound good. So it's when making those mixed decisions, it's a lot easier when you have a monitor engineer who's taking care of everybody on stage for you. So all you have to think about is the audience. But when you don't have that, you've just got to work closely with your musicians, both on the stage and in the pit, to make sure that they trust you and that they're happy with what they're hearing throughout the rehearsal process. So that way when you get to shows, when the inevitable thing goes wrong, they trust that you're working to fix it. Even if it's not sounding great to them, they'll still trust that it's sounding good in the house and you're taking that as priority. And that you're working to get things back on track for them on stage. So it's a juggling act, but it's part of the fun.
Yeah, I like that you say that. I've worked with some sound engineers that will be like, well, I'm sorry it sounds bad in the pit, but it sounds good in like out in the house. And you're like, well, it's helpful if it sounds good down here too. Because like what we're responding to what we're hearing, like we're not responding to what we can't hear in the house. So we're most musicians are their playing is influenced by what they're hearing, whether it's from the monitors or acoustically. And so, yeah, it's always helpful if it sounds good to everyone.
Oh yeah, no, that's the goal, is to make sure that everyone in the room is happy. Because if the energy on stage isn't right, then the energy's not right anywhere else, and you can't force that. And when you build up that trust over the rehearsal process, as much as you can, whether that rehearsal is a 2-hour sound check in the middle of the day and that's it before the show that night, or whether it's a multi-week rehearsal process, you've got to build up that trust so that way when it doesn't sound good on stage, because it's going to happen, it always does for whatever reason. There's a million things that can go wrong and at least one of them will. When that thing goes wrong, that way your musicians are trusting you that you're fixing it, and you're doing your best to make sure that they're happy as well as the audience.
What are some other ways, if you can think of any, that you build trust with the people you're working with during the rehearsal process?
That kind of depends. When I'm doing a one-off show where I've got rehearsal that day for a concert that night, whether it's a cabaret show, I'm the A2 for a musical that's touring and coming through town, or if I'm the A2 being the monitor engineer, or if it's a show that I'm with through most of the rehearsal process, or at least part of the rehearsal process, even if that part is just tech, and having that time. So when I have a very short process, like just that day, the first thing I do to make sure that I can build that trust is I spend the morning getting everything ready ahead of time that I can. So whatever information I've gotten from the band ahead of time to make sure I've got the instruments and mics that they want when they come in. And if I have any questions, I've got them ready to go. So when they walk in, they're ready to play. For the monitors, I've got a basic mix that it's not going to be what they want, but it's going to be good enough that they could play if they needed to. And by having these little things just throughout the day and having water on stage ready and, just the little things and greeting them, making sure that they know I'm there for them and just spend the time talking to them. That's one of those big things that you can't just go hide in your sound booth as much as you want to. Even when you're not necessarily getting along with the musicians, you've still got to do what you can to make sure that you're being cordial and friendly with them and that you're getting along. When it's a quick turnaround, it's a little bit harder, but when you've got that time, that might mean that one night you and the band all go together and go out to eat, go get drinks, whatever floats the boat of the group you're with. Try to have fun with them. If you have time during sound check that the band wants to just groove a little bit, don't cut them off, let them groove and enjoy it yourself. It also, because that helps you too. It gives you a chance to see how the band grooves together, because that's what they're going to do during the show. And learning how they groove helps you groove with them. Mm-hmm. So it's just important to be receptive to what they need and try and build those bonds, whether it's a short-term or a long-term thing.
Mm-hmm. The personal relationships that you have with people, I mean, it's not like you have to be everyone's friend, but those connections with people, that's what makes our job so I think that's what helps the magic of theater come alive. It's not,
Oh, most definitely.
Yeah, people you work with that put their job in front of, like those people skills and building trust with people and listening to people when they're saying there's a problem. Putting what you need to do ahead of that damages those relationships, and then the groove, the magic, the whatever you want to call it, doesn't happen.
Oh, exactly. I mean, everything about, I don't think there's a job in theater, and there are some that are somewhat, but I don't think there's a job in theater that doesn't require you to have that need to reach out and make connections. Mm-hmm. If you're only like in the shop, so you never interact with the actors, you still are making that connection with the fellow people in the shop and with the designers and the technical director, and they're making those connections back on the performance side. And so even that person in the shop is making that connection to get those needs met for what the performers are needing to do their job and be happy doing it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. So take us through, like, the term sound engineer encompasses a lot of jobs. And every theater is different, of course, based on their budget and who they hire and what their needs are. But take us through some of the roles under the sound engineer umbrella and what those roles do.
Sound engineer encompasses a very vast network of things, just like any title in theater. And theater specifically, your sound engineer might be the sound designer as well. They also might be a one-person show where that person behind the mixing desk is also in charge of all monitors on stage, in charge of all wireless coordination, and in charge of making sure that everybody's mics are working correctly and all that maintenance done on them, and maintenance on the speakers, and making sure the system is built and pieced together correctly for every show. Because if you're in a touring house or you are touring, then you might be building that sound system every day for the show, and part of your job is to make sure that it works consistently for the design every time, and you can always accomplish what it's supposed to do for the integrity of the show. But it might also get divided up. If your show's large enough, then you're going to have a person who's backstage in charge of monitors. You might have a person backstage who's in charge of the deck sound position, who's in charge of just making sure that the mics are on the actors correctly and working, and their entire job during a show is to make sure nothing goes wrong, and when it goes wrong, to fix it. So they might spend the entire show in a hammock sleeping, and that's a great show. They also might spend the entire show sprinting up and down the stairs, running to every single actor and hoping and praying to get things fixed. And it might still be a great show, but that individual might be suffering. You just never know. But there's also, depending on how intense the sound design is. The sound designer might be composing. They might be recording all the instruments for those songs they compose. They might have to record a band for a show because the band is just recording the show and then the show goes on without the band. There's just a lot of random little things. If you have enough wireless mics, you want someone whose entire job is to watch that wireless equipment and make sure that it's not getting interference and that none of the wireless mics are going out, and do wireless mic swaps. And that alone can be a really hard job and is a highly specialized field. I know around here there's only a handful of people in this area that can actually do RF coordination. So, and that's the thing about audio engineering, is there's a lot of different audio engineers out there, and most of them have a specialized field in audio engineering, but that doesn't necessarily mean they can't do the other jobs that other audio engineers are doing. So it's a lot of little things that you've got to be specialized in, but also be a jack of all trades in.
Mm-hmm. What's your specialization?
I do RF coordination. And
what does RF stand for?
It's your wireless microphones, radio frequency. My primary specialty is live mixing. Specifically, I do line-by-line mixing for musicals, but I also will mix bands and even corporate events when there's not a lot of work.
Yeah. So I was talking to someone, and I think they were a sound designer maybe, and they were saying how when it comes to sound, everyone's an expert. You know, when it comes to like scenery, people aren't like, they don't state things as facts. But when it comes to sound, people tend to state things as facts. Like, that was too loud, not like, I think that was too loud. So how do you handle, you're in a lose-lose situations a lot of time, you know, because you have the director telling you one thing, you have the music director saying another thing sometimes, and you have audience members complaining about other things. So how do you handle all of these opinions about from the sound experts?
Well, the most important thing to remember when you're doing sound is everyone is an audio expert, because audio is an objective field. And so what that means is it might sound great to me. It might be the best sounding show I've ever had, but there might not be a single person in the audience who agrees with me. And that makes me wrong. It makes me right to me. I might think I'm right, but if there's not a single person who agrees with me that it was a good sounding show, then I'm wrong. But if the majority of the people in the house enjoyed the show, it doesn't matter whether or not I did, because that meant that it was a good show. Your goal is to get every single person in that audience to enjoy the show and to think it sounded great. But realistically, that's not going to happen. If it does, which it does happen, it has happened to me where I've gotten no negative feedback about a show. But to getting those is like winning the lottery. It doesn't really happen very often. Once you realize that everyone is an audio expert, and I'm being serious when I say that, then it's a lot easier to start to try and figure out exactly how to fit everyone's needs. Because that's kind of your goal. Not entirely, but kind of your goal. Your goal is to get as many people happy with the sound as possible. You've got the more important opinions, yours, a sound designer's, and your music directors and your directors. Those are the more important opinions that you're looking for during your rehearsal process. Once the show starts and it's actually in run, then you're feeling the energy of the crowd and watching their reactions and trying to get an overall feeling. You're still going to get just about every show someone coming up and saying, hey, that was too loud, or it was harsh, or, you know, I didn't like it, it sounded bad. If they can't give you specific criticism, it doesn't really help you. And so you've got to look at specific criticism and even general criticism, and just a little bit harder too with general criticism, but look at all the criticism and figure out where the common through line is.
Hmm.
But keep in mind, you're not going to hear from people nearly as often when it sounded good.
Mm-hmm.
So look for that common through line of what went wrong, and then you can look at it at yourself and what you felt during the show and what you heard during the show and say, okay, this is what I need to work on and how I need to improve the show. Don't discount anyone's opinion just because you don't know who they are, or you think it sounded great, because everyone has a valid opinion. It might even be that there's a bad piece of equipment. I was mixing a show and there was a fill speaker that had gone out. And so there was just this group of people in the house. And it was just from that one group who had left complaints with front of house. And it took us a bit before we finally narrowed down what the problem was, because it was only the people in that section that were saying there were a lot of issues. Like, it was all muddy and buzzy and didn't sound good, and they couldn't quite figure out why. And so we went and did some investigating and tested all the speakers, and we found, oh, well, we had a speaker that went out. Fix that speaker, fixed the problem.
Mm-hmm.
So everyone has a valid opinion. So don't discount someone's opinion just because you don't like it.
Mm-hmm. You can't let your pride get wrapped up into it.
Exactly. And I mean, you should be proud of the work you're doing. If you're not proud of it, what's the point? But don't let your pride stop you from taking criticism. And don't let the criticism hurt you, because you're going to get that. And it's important to use that to help you grow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I was listening to an interview. I think it was a bass player it doesn't matter. But he was saying that I was listening to an interview from some bass player, and he was saying that art is a service. At the time in my life, I was young and stupid, and I was like, art isn't a service. Like, I'm doing this for me. Like, who cares if you listen? Like, it's what I want to do. But like, the older I get, the more I realize, like, oh, what we're doing is a service. Like, what we're providing, we're filling a need for people. They need to connect, and they need to, come to a show and leave feeling good about themselves, or, feeling good about life, and experience magic and whatnot. And so I think the older I get, the more I really I'm more convinced that what we're doing really, we're serving the audience members for sure.
Oh, I'd take that a little bit further, though. It's not just that we're serving the audience. We're serving each other as we do this art. It doesn't matter if it's a garage band that we get together on the weekends and we play and we never do a concert. We're connecting with each other, and we're serving ourselves and our own artistic need. And that's just as valid and as important as, serving the artistic need of an audience. So I think it goes beyond just we're servicing the audience. We're also trying to service ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And they're both very important.
Mm-hmm.
But yes, it is definitely a service to the general public as well.
Mm-hmm. I love that. I think that's one of the things that keeps me in theater when it gets hard. It gets hard to make a living, and it gets discouraging. Like, as a musician, I'm usually in these tiny spaces, and I'm like, I'm too old for this.
Right.
Or I'm taking my bass up to this rickety platform, and I'm like, I'm gonna die up here. This is gonna be where it ends.
Yep.
But I think that's what keeps me coming back. Not only that I love to play, but also just the connections that you make with people are much more. They're richer than connections you make with people like at your day job, or there's something powerful about making art together that you connect in just a deeper way.
I had so this was after a show in Creed, and I think it was 9 to 5 actually. And I got in a little bit of trouble with the stage manager, because after the show, one of the audience members came up to me, and this is one of the disadvantages of the mixing position being in the house, but also it's one of the advantages. I mean, it's vital for it to be where you can hear what's actually going on, but the audience members want to connect with you afterwards. And so I had this audience member who came up, and it was all very harsh criticism for the show. Had a lot of negative things to say about what I was doing. But so we sat there and talked, and we just chatted for a while and talked about what he was hearing and what I was hearing. And we figured out why there's this discrepancy between what we were feeling about the show. And it helped me a lot in what I wanted to do with that particular show and the direction I wanted to take it audio wise. And it really, really helped me grow as an artist to be able to figure out some of these little things for for a person with a different kind of hearing than I have, because I work hard to maintain my hearing and most people don't. And so getting to hear this other perspective and the two of us talk and just connect was incredible. And he came back and saw the show later, and after we talked, and he was like, yeah, it was a lot better. There was still some issues he had, but he enjoyed it a lot more. And it was just, to get technical here, the only difference I made was like a 2 dB cut on one frequency range and on one person's mic, and that made all the world of difference for that individual.
Mm-hmm.
And for most of the audience, they wouldn't have noticed the difference. Mm-hmm. So little things like that can make a big difference for individuals in the audience.
So you mentioned maintaining your hearing. How do you do that?
The most important thing is just protect it. If you don't own custom earplugs or, anything like that, some foamies, those cheap, terrible ones you see on construction sites, are better than nothing. If you go to live concerts, wear earplugs. If you're performing in a pit, musicians' earplugs, you can get some pretty cheap ones. I was doing a show for the Indian Temple here in Kansas City, and so I was mixing monitors backstage, and so I put earplugs in because I'm sitting right next to the percussion section on the show. And one of the drummers, he was in town visiting for the show. He comes up to me and goes, why are you wearing earplugs? I was like, because it helps me hear things a lot clearer, hear everything a lot clearer, because everything's so loud. Mm-hmm. It cuts through the noise. He tried them, and that night he ended up ordering himself a pair. It's just one of the most important things is if you're in loud environments regularly, just wear earplugs, especially at concerts. I don't care if it looks dumb. It's worth it because once you lose your hearing, it's gone forever.
Yeah, it blows my mind when I'm in pits and people and musicians don't wear earplugs. As woodwind players and trumpet players, it's different because they hear the sound in their head, right? Because they're blowing in their instrument. Mm-hmm. But especially like drummers, I'm like, how do you not wear earplugs?
Like that's one of the things that I wish in my own life was that in high school on drumline that they encouraged us to wear earplugs. They didn't do that. They weren't available for us. They didn't even mention that it was a thing that you should do. Mm-hmm. And I wish they had, because I know some of my fellow drummers are very, very deaf now. Mm-hmm. And a simple thing, musicians' earplugs, you're still going to hear everything the way it was intended to be heard, just quieter.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of earplugs. Anything else that you do to maintain your hearing?
No, it's more about sanity beyond that, just finding quiet places when I can.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
For hearing, it's literally just, if you think it's loud, put earplugs in because that means it's loud.
Yeah. One thing I've started to do, especially during like a busy gig season, so we're recording this in January, so December and the holiday season just passed, and I had a lot of gigs, which was great. But I was driving one time and I had the radio on and I was like, man, I'm so tired of hearing. So I just had to start not listening to the radio and not having background music on when I was just putzing around my apartment. But if you're in a hearing career, being aware of how much noise you're just surrounding yourself with that you have control over is really important.
In general, I can't overstate how much silence is so good for your health. And just your mental health, your hearing health, whatever. And it's different for everyone, but for me, if I'm working a show, then after the show's over, I drive home in silence. It's a 45-minute drive, and it's quiet the whole way because then I can have that peace and quiet. There's nobody talking to me. It's just quiet. And if you've never taken the chance to just sit somewhere in silence, get yourself some noise-canceling headphones, some earplugs, find the quietest place in your house, and put them in. Read a book. Do whatever you want to do. Just do it in silence. Even 10, 15 minutes. It might be a lot for you, but I think you might notice that afterwards it's really nice. Mm-hmm. That silence can't be overrated. And when I worked on the cruise ship, that was the hardest thing to find, was just silence. But when I found it, it was amazing.
Yeah. Take us through, since you mentioned cruise ship and you've talked about other gigs that you've done, take us through a little bit of your background, where you're from, how you got into theater, and how you got to where you are now.
I'm from Lawrence, Kansas. I started in theater really young in life. My father is a technical director and lighting designer. And so I kind of got to start real young, especially into lighting. And so got my first professional gig when I was in high school, just doing changeovers, lighting changeovers. And then after high school, futzed around working for a couple years before going to school down in Texas, where I wanted to kind of break away from lighting a little bit. It's not that I didn't like doing it, it's that I wanted to see more of what I could be doing. And I fell in love with audio while I was in school. Mixed my first musical there. I think it was Footloose. It's my first time trying to mix a musical. Looking back, I made so many mistakes, but I thought I did a great job at the time, at least.
Didn't we all?
Right. And it just kind of took off from there. I went from mixing, because my first show was 14, maybe 15 wireless microphones. Ended up mixing a show at one point while I was there with 36 channels of wireless microphones. Did another show where it was only 34 channels of wireless, but the orchestra was backstage, so I had to mic just about every instrument and definitely every section, because it was not an acoustically ideal place, so we had to get a full mix of them. And I maxed out the console on that one. Ran out of inputs, and so I had to change the sound design for it to take less channels on the console, because I needed every channel I could get for the orchestra. And, doing some smaller shows too. Like after I went to school, I ended up in Colorado. My first year there, working just as one of the engineers there. And I was the deck sound operator. So, and this was before we had wireless out there. So it was just, my job was to basically help the assistant stage managers backstage. And before the show, help with changeovers to get the audio equipment set up. But that year, the head of sound out there, Jake Harper, he put me in charge of a gala event that Creed Repertory Theater was doing. And it was the first year Creed was doing a gala. And after that gala was a big point for us as the sound department in Creed to separate the designer from the engineer at Creed and help them grow in that way. And Jake Harbour, who was the head of the department, but also designing every single show that summer, he was one of the biggest drivers for this change. And so the next summer when I came out as head of the sound department. And Jake was just designing. And that was a huge difference for Creed. And it helped us out there a lot, both in our sanity as a sound department and in what we could do for sound for shows. Because all of a sudden the designer had the time to really go all out with his designs. And it was great. And so after that, we started really growing the sound department out in Creed. Started getting wireless microphones because the actors were suffering some really bad vocal fatigue summer after summer, because it was true rep. And so these singers were out on stage every night. If they weren't singing, they were still on stage for something. Mm-hmm. And we had so many actors just losing their voice. And so my third year out there, we started getting wireless. And so the leads were in wireless to try and save their voices, and that made a world of difference. And after that, Creed went all out and said, okay, we're going wireless, which made it a lot easier for us to bring the band out on stage and really incorporate them into the set design for the show or into the show itself, depending on what show we were doing. That also really helped out there. And around this time, we also lost our soundboard. And so that's when I got my first foray into installing sound systems. It wasn't the first system I'd installed, but it was the first sound system that I'd spec'd from start to finish and then installed. So that was also a really good experience for me. So I did that out in Creed for 5 years. In between that, there was one year I went out on a cruise ship, working as the sound engineer for all the shows on the ship. And then, so now, after that year, I came back to Kansas City, the Kansas City area, and I've just been working for the Stagehand Union as an audio engineer and sometimes just general stagehand. But
what's the cruise ship experience like? I hear a lot of mixed reviews about cruise ships, so I'm always curious about people's experiences.
If you have good people in your department especially, then it can be a lot of fun. It was very boring for me. I ended up, while I was on ship, I ended up automating the console for all of the production shows that we did on the ship, which was 3 different shows. So every cruise, we'd have a show every night. And we had 3 production shows, which were the ones that we self-produced with the performers that the company hired. And then there were guest entertainers the rest of the nights. So for the production shows, I automated the console and QLab, all the timings in QLab, and then linked them and had their timings set. So that way, at the top of the show, I'd hit go in QLab, and then I'd be done for the rest of the night. Out of the 3 shows, which each one was an hour long, between all 3 shows, I hit spacebar 4 times.
Living the dream.
Which, after that, I got a lot more bored. So that didn't help me any. It filled my time a little bit for a while, but in the long run, that might have made it worse. So I read a lot of books. It's not a bad experience. It's just, it was boring for me.
Yeah.
Because it was the same thing day in and day out. And one of the reasons why I love theater is just the sheer unpredictability of it. Mm-hmm. The only time we ever had anything really unpredictable was when they had to shut off all power to the ship for some random thing while we reported. And so we come back to the booth that night, and the entire booth is soaking wet from the condensation in the air.
Oh, no.
Yeah, all the lighting consoles and sound console and all that fun stuff was just sopping wet. So we had to unplug all the power distros so that way it could all dry off before we powered on. Although I guess there was one other really exciting night that we were going around a storm, and we had 40, 50-foot waves because we were trying to avoid the storm, and we ended up hitting it a little bit. And so we had to go down to the theater, which is at the very, very front of the ship, and tie everything down. The drum set backstage got ratcheted to a wall. The bass case got ratcheted down. Even up in the booth, the stools got tied down that we sat in. We had to figure out a way to tie down the consoles with nothing but gaff tape and rope. It worked well enough. And so after we finished tying everything down, we're just sitting there. And this is the very front of the ship where the rocking's the worst. And we're just sitting there and talking, and we can hear the waves hit. And every time it hits, we're just like, oh, maybe we should go back to our cabins where it's a little bit safer. Every single time a wave hit. Until finally, this is, an hour or 2 hours later, a wave hits and it knocks the stool out from under one of us, and we're like, all right, now we're definitely going.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there's some things that are a lot of fun, but overall, and it can be a lot of fun for people, but for me, I don't like the nothing ever goes wrong thing.
Yeah. How does your experience in lighting help you with audio engineering? Or does it? Does it influence what you do?
I know trigonometry a lot better.
Okay.
And that helps. Because despite what we would like to think, in theater we do a lot of math. Just about every space I've ever been in, I end up working really closely with the lighting department. Whether it's because lighting department provides the power for audio department, or because we're trying to share the same spaces, because lighting needs to put things hidden out of the way, and so does sound. So I end up working with them a lot, and being able to speak that language does help quite a bit. But I'm sure there's a lot of things that I do and that are in my brain and help me out every day I know because I started out in lighting and no lighting, but if they are, they're subconscious things. So it's not something I really think about.
Sure. You also mentioned like the split between sound designer and engineer. How does that relationship work? Does a sound designer say, here are the sounds I'm using for the show? Do you have a lot of freedom with what a sound designer gives you, or does it come to you pretty like these are the levels? And
it purely depends on the show, the engineers, and the designers.
Okay.
So like in Creed, if I wasn't on the musical specifically, if I wasn't designing that musical and we had a separate designer, the designer we had, I worked with very closely already, and they knew my preferences while mixing, and they liked those preferences, and so that's what they wanted. And so I had a lot of leeway in how to mix because they just wanted it to sound good, and that was my job. It doesn't necessarily happen like that. So sometimes you'll come in as the sound engineer and you've got to learn how it's supposed to sound, and your job is to maintain that. And so you might make changes here and there to the EQ and some other levels here and there, but all of it is in keeping with the sound and style and everything that the sound designer left for you. And in those instances, your job might just be to program the console and get each scene set how the designer wants it to sound, or the designer might have programmed it for you and your job is just to run it. Purely depends on the designer, the show, and the engineer, and the relationship between all three of those. And I've done kind of both ends of the spectrum, where my job was to come in and make sure it sounds the exact same way the designer said it, and that, like the cruise ship, where I just hit go. And at the beginning of the show, I'd make sure everything still sounded right, and if it did still sound right, then I could just hit go. And then shows where I'm the designer and the engineer, and so I spend every show deciding how I want it to sound in that moment. But even in that instance, there's still it needs to be consistent across an entire run. And so it doesn't matter if that run is a weekend or 3 or 4 months or whatever, it's still got to be consistent, even with different actors.
Consistency is the word, I think, for theater. For as a musician, it's kind of interesting, like, especially as a bass player, our parts are usually pretty simple compared to, like, playing a Beethoven symphony or whatnot. But consistency night after night is so hard. Like playing the same show with the same energy, like no matter how much sleep you got, no matter what your mental state, maybe, like personal things may be going on, like just being able to show up and be consistent is such an important skill for theater. So how do you grow in your consistency in what you do?
A lot of people have, their pre-show traditions, and I do as well. And there might be some superstition in it for some people, but for me, having those pre-show traditions are what allow me to get in the same mindset consistently. And by being in that same mindset consistently, it's a little bit easier to make sure that everything else I'm doing is consistent. Pre-show tradition might be, I need 5 minutes of silence by myself, not bothered. It might be, I have to eat this specific thing at this much time before the show. But I know for me, what I like to do is about 15 minutes before start of show, I go over to the console and I just sit in the booth, and it's my time. Oftentimes, since the booth's in the house, I'll put my headphones on, so that way the audience members aren't really bothering me. I'll go through each channel, make sure everything looks right, and just kind of, look at the script at various places if there's something in there that's a tricky spot or something. But it's just, I take that 15 minutes to just center myself and make sure I'm in the headspace of focusing on the show. And if that gets interrupted, which it does sometimes, then that's the way it is for that show, and that's fine. You just have to be able to cope with the fact that sometimes you won't get to be able to follow your tradition that you have of whatever that is.
That's also why I hate wearing a costume. I hate it so much because there's something about like putting on all blacks that's just like, okay, it's time to go. Like that's your mental
part of what your mental switch is.
Yeah.
And I get that, but that's one of the reasons why I try to not include what I'm wearing as part of getting in the mental headspace.
Yeah.
Just because I never know what I'm going to have to wear.
Yeah.
It almost always is just standard blacks or I'm in the house, don't look like trash.
Yeah.
But I try to not include what I'm wearing in that, because then if something happens to that, I don't have to worry about it.
Yeah, I should probably stop doing that.
It's hard. It's so hard to get in the right headspace, though.
Yeah.
It can be so hard to get in the right headspace, no matter what happens. Like, it could just be something someone says can knock you right out of it, and then all of a sudden, for the rest of the night, you just can't get back into the groove for the show. Mm-hmm. One missed pickup, and all of a sudden, the entire rest of the show, you don't feel right about it. Show might have been fine, but you just can't feel good about it.
Mm-hmm. But then after a while, after you've done so many shows, you just look like, okay, whatever, that show wasn't my best, or everything went wrong. Like every time I needed to switch an instrument, it went wrong, or, but oh well, there's another show tomorrow or this evening, or you learn.
Well, that's, I think, the most important thing that as an artist you can learn is to let go. Once the show's over, it's over. Yeah. There's no changing it. Mm-hmm. It was good, it was bad, it doesn't matter. Mm-hmm. It's that show's over. Let it go. It's in the past. If you made mistakes, you can still learn from them. If it was a perfect show, doesn't matter. It's that show's in the past. You learn from what you did and you move on. Mm-hmm. It's the hardest thing to learn, is to just let go of it and be in that moment. Mm-hmm. Can't focus on that mistake you made 16 bars ago.
Yeah. And if you are focused, if you let one mistake take your focus, I mean, the odds that you're going to make another mistake very soon after are extremely high, because if you have to stay in the moment and let those mistakes go by, because like you said, they're gone. You can't do anything about them. Mm-hmm. But what you can do, like what you have control over, is what you're doing at that moment. Yeah,
exactly. You've just got to stay in the moment and keep pushing forward. Mm-hmm. And the second you stop doing that, that's when you start falling behind. Mm-hmm.
From my perspective, it seems like stage managers and sound engineers are usually the first people at the theater and usually the last people to leave the theater. So how do you stay mentally engaged when you've had, like a 90-hour work week, or, all these problems unexpectedly fell on your lap a day before opening and you have to fix them all? Mentally, how do you keep yourself composed when you're really tired, or you're really frustrated, or you've worked way too many hours that week?
Well, I might be a really bad example, because I thrive on that.
Okay.
My favorite days at work are the days where everything goes wrong and I spend the whole day troubleshooting and am mentally dead by the end of the day.
Why?
I don't know. I just love it. There's no real good reason. I just do. I remember I actually had just had this conversation with a fellow stagehand, one of the other audio engineers in the stagehand union with me. I just had this conversation with him about how I thrive on the chaos of last minute and things aren't going right. It wasn't even half an hour later, because of course, as soon as you say something like that, something's going to go wrong.
Yeah.
And this was a corporate gig, so usually those are super cush and easy. And it wasn't even half hour later when the client comes in and our boss comes in and they're saying the other ballroom lost power. A transformer had blown up the street. And so our half of the building still had power, but that half didn't. Mm-hmm. And so we had to throw together a pieced together sound system and video projectors out of just whatever we could find and steal from other spaces, and throw them together and throw them up. And we had about 30 minutes to do this. And I loved it. It was a lot of fun. Afterwards, my friend goes, "So you enjoyed that?" And I was like, "Yeah, I really enjoyed it. It was a lot of fun." And, I'm sitting there throwing directions out to 4 different people as to what they need to do and get the sound system up and running. And the other sound engineer who's there with me is just like, "I can't keep up. Just leave me here." So I'm probably a really bad example for that, because I enjoy it.
Yeah. I mean, that's one of the reasons I like theaters. I like being the only person on a part. Like, I like the pressure of, you know, like, so in like sometimes in chamber music or when you're playing in an orchestra, there's 8 other people playing the exact same thing as you.
Yeah.
So you spend a lot of your time trying to play like the 7 other bass players. But yeah, in theater, I like the pressure of, like, there's a lot riding on everyone's shoulders, you know, involved in theater. I mean, there's so many people involved, but a lot rides on everyone.
Any one of those people messes up, all of a sudden it takes everyone else to be able to cover for that because that one person messed up. And that's, I mean, it's kind of beautiful.
Yeah, it's a beautiful picture of community. Some of my favorite gigs have been when I've played for youth theater.
Yeah.
Because you never know what they're going to do. And, you know, like, so many times they'll like skip a verse in a song, or someone will start singing early. You know, they didn't do like their cue line. And I love it. I love the pressure of what's going to happen because you don't know.
You got to be ready to change everything in an instant.
Yeah, I think it's fun. So similar, I guess.
Yeah, it's kind of the fun thing of all of that. Of just this world in general is you got to be able to change everything in an instant because everything might change.
Yeah.
You never know what's going to happen.
Yeah. You've mentioned to me before, like, certifications that you have. Maybe talk about some of the ones you have, and is that a requirement for what you do, like for someone wanting to be in the audio engineer world, or is it just helpful?
There are absolutely no certifications that are required to be an audio engineer, which is cool.
It's terrifying.
I mean, it's really cool in the fact that, like, that means there's no barrier for entry, so anybody can come in and learn. But also, that makes it harder on paper to say, I've been doing this forever and I know what I'm doing versus I've been doing this forever and I've been guessing all along.
Yeah.
But there are some things that you can learn that really help, like learning Dante networking, and there are certifications available for that are super helpful. If you can get console training time, whatever company is doing the console training will quote unquote certify you. And that can help you not because you're certified in Dante Digital Audio Networking or because you're certified to use these specific consoles, but because it gets you that hands-on time to learn and to be able to have experience with that equipment and know how to use it and how to troubleshoot it. And in this day and age, taking that time to learn digital consoles and digital audio are super helpful. And whether it's Dante or Maddie, but in my experience, at least, Dante seems to be the more common one unless you're using Midas consoles. So having that time to learn Dante and Maddie is super helpful.
Do those consoles stay pretty consistent over the years, or are there a lot of changes always happening with the equipment that you use?
Digital consoles are all based on analog consoles. And that means that while they change drastically all the time, that basic framework that the designers who are making these consoles are approaching it from is the same. And so in that sense, if you know one digital console, you know them all. But that isn't true at all. Because even though that basic framework is the same, getting to that basic framework is not. But that's one of the reasons why I like Yamaha consoles. It doesn't matter if you're on an LS9 or a PM10. That basic framework and the way that console's laid out is nearly identical, and so you can find your way around it. The same is true for the Midas lines of consoles and your Soundcraft line of consoles. The key to learning any of these digital consoles isn't necessarily being an expert in using them or knowing a lot of different consoles. The key is having the time to explore the console a little bit and figure out where the things are and what that specific company calls it. And that's the hardest part, is just learning where the things that you need are and what they're called, because there might be different names for them on different consoles.
How do you grow? How do you get better? How do you stay inspired? How do you keep things from getting stale?
The best way to grow, at the very least, is every time you're behind a console, every time you're even just listening to music, try listening both to the music and the way it's making you feel and how it's trying to move you, and listen to what the instruments and the singers and every little thing is doing to try to move you that way. And then when you're behind a console, just every time you're behind a console, look at it as an opportunity to practice and get better. And if you're working with another engineer, always, always, always be happy to ask questions and learn from what they're doing, because so many of us have just kind of guessed our way into getting good at it that there's a lot of different ways that we approach it, and learning those different ways can be super helpful. I think the most important thing for getting better is just don't be afraid to learn, whether it's from pre-recorded music, fellow engineers, someone who has no idea what they're doing. It doesn't matter. Just be willing to learn, because even if you're watching someone behind a console that really doesn't know what they're doing, you can still learn by seeing what they're doing wrong and how you could fix it. And or if you're teaching someone, as you're trying to teach someone, use that as an opportunity to teach yourself too. How you teach someone directly reflects how well you understand the material. So
Definitely.
you can use that to help as well. As far as it not getting stale, I don't know. It just hasn't yet. There's so much to it and so many different sides to it that it hasn't gotten boring yet. So I think just staying engaged with it is what's kept me interested.
Yeah, it's a fine line, being proud at the skills that you have and the work that you do, but then also being humble to learn from other people, like having both and not having too much of one or the other.
Yeah, exactly. You'll never get better. You'll never even maintain how good you are if you're not willing to keep learning, because the technology's changing, and so the techniques that we can use and the tools available to us are changing.
Two final questions. My first one, biggest pet peeve or biggest pet peeves as when you're mixing and dealing, so let's say you're mixing a musical. Let's start with that. A musical, and you're back at the board mixing. Biggest pet peeve or pet peeves when dealing with actors, musicians, whatever.
One of the biggest ones, and I know a lot of people can relate to this one, is insert your instrument into this, but in this case, it's a soundboard. But when someone walks by and goes, "Whoa, do you know what all those buttons and knobs do? Or do you really know how to use that?" That is... Or, what would happen if I touched this or did this? And it's like, don't touch this. This console's worth more than your life. It's worth more than my life too. Yeah. So, that's definitely one of the big pet peeves. But and there's always little things that come up, and it doesn't matter what the pet peeve is though, and how much it infuriates you. You can't let it show, because the second you show your actor, performer, musician, whatever, that they are annoying you, it becomes a lot harder to build that relationship with them and have a healthy and beneficial relationship, because if you're annoyed with them and they know it, why would they care about helping you out? Because you're just mad at them and they don't think they did anything wrong necessarily. So it doesn't matter what your pet peeves are. It doesn't matter how infuriating someone is. You've just got to bear with it and always remember, chances are you're not going to have to deal with them for very long. Yeah. Because if it's something really bad, then, talk to your production manager, your stage manager, and say, hey, this is an issue. And maybe you've talked to the musician about it or the singer about it, and nothing's happened and nothing's changed. Well, then if it's a really actual problem and not just an annoyance, then it's going to get fixed, whether it's because that person's going to move on to another company or that person's just not going to be hired back. So it's never worth showing how mad you are at someone.
Yeah. Agreed. That's why it's also nice to have friends that you can rant to.
Yes. Having your buddies that you can just go off on a rant to that know that it's not a serious thing. You just needed to let off that steam helps so much.
Yeah, for sure. All right, final question. Advice to young people who want to be a sound engineer.
Listen. Just listen. It's that simple. Whether you are getting some training from a grumpy sound guy who's willing to teach you a little bit, or whether it's because you're at a concert and you're just listening, and listen to how the instruments fit together, listen to how things are growing together so that way it creates that experience you're in, and listen to how even something as simple as where the speaker is affects how it's affecting you. And when you're in the natural world, listen to how that sound is affecting you. So it's not just listening to the sound outside, it's listening to how it affects you. You're listening to yourself as well. Whether it's you're out in the woods and listening to the nature around you, you're in the city walking down the street, and how does the sound of the city affect you? There's sound is always around us and it's always affecting us, whether we realize it or not. And so the most important thing you can do is just start being receptive to that, and that'll help you get a good idea of whether you're interested in sound, like really, and whether you want to be a designer or just a recording engineer, or you want to be a live sound engineer. There's so many different avenues that you can go down that, if you enjoy listening to things, there's something for you.
The music for the Backstage Creative was improvised and performed by Ian Leroy, and the logo was designed by Zach Rimbold.